Welcome, everybody. I'm Bill Adams, and this is, as Blaine said, the third of our emergency webinar series. This is the second episode of kind of an ongoing webinar theme of what am I supposed to do now. We played Joe Walsh's Life Has Been Good to Me So Far, and many of you probably don't think that's the case right now, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. And we want to provide you with the information that are going to help you get through these really unprecedented times. So today, this webinar is really going to focus on labor law, employees, different options that are out there, and we'll get more into details. But many of you know there have been some federal relief packages. The Family First Act was passed last week. That pertains to some practices, maybe not all, because it's many practices are under 50 people. There's another bill that's being actively discussed. So there's a lot of different questions people have, and what we're going to do is address those. I'd like to say one thing, just to thank, again, Sientra for helping us put on these series. Blaine Hamilton, who's the Director of Medical Affairs and Professional Education for Sientra, has really been running technical lead on these webinars, but the support from Sientra goes without saying, has been really essential to offer these to all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Blaine for a minute before I introduce the speakers to just go over some technical things to make this smooth for you. So Blaine, thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for partnering with us on this. I think this has been really important for us all together to get together somewhat routinely. So people have asked a lot. What we've done now is make this a repeat deal. So this will be every Monday and Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is 4 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully everyone can still spend time with their families over the dinner hour. So go ahead and put that on your calendar, and you should receive an email with your registration link the day following each webinar with a topic and link to the next one. So in that way, you guys can kind of know what to expect and sift through all the emails we're all getting right now. So with that, thank you very much for being here. You see the buttons for Zoom on the bottom. This is really important that as we really have capacity up to 1,000. But as we look to add people here, it's important to keep the bandwidth down so that we don't have interruptions in the program. So please move your cursor around on your screen or tap on it if you're on a mobile device. And you should see these buttons at the bottom left. Make sure you're on mute. So it should have a line through it. Start off on video, line through it. And then the chat button will allow you to submit questions on the right, either privately to myself or Sue Dickema, or publicly to everyone, and that'll really lead the conversation at the end of the program. So thanks again for having Sientra be part of your world, and back to you, Bill.
Thanks again, Blaine. So, just as a disclaimer, obviously we're giving our ideas, but this is there's nothing here that's definitive, but we're trying to give you as much of the information that's really evolving and very dynamic as we can, because I think that's what a lot of people need. So let's go to the next slide, Blaine. So, we have a couple of really great experts to talk to you today, and we will just go for an hour. So we're going to go, we've got Renee Coover, who's an attorney here in Dallas, actually, with Byrd and Adatto, who's really going to focus on labor law and some of the relief packages. And then we have Sandy Roos, who many of you know has been doing practice consulting now for 30 years and spent many, many years in plastic surgery, and is really a true expert in what practices can do, particularly in these crisis situations. So they're going to talk for about 10 minutes each. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time on your questions. We've received many of those, and we will try to address as many of those as possible. So with that introduction, I want to start with Renee. Renee, thanks so much for coming on, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bill and Blaine, for having me. So we're going to talk about two bills that are the talk of the town right now. For some of you who may have been on the webinar Monday, I went in depth on the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is what we're going to start with today. And I'll say first that this is all happening for us in real time. So everything is changing day by day, hour by hour in some respects. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about is could change actually while I'm talking, which is possible. But we just want to keep in mind that what we're saying today is subject to change depending on what happens with each of the bills. So I'm an employment lawyer with 10 years of experience doing employment work. And I will say I have personally never encountered a situation like this before. So there's lots of questions that I'm getting, and some of which are unknown. So we are going to do our best to answer as many as we can. So I will start with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I'm sure everyone is either familiar or becoming familiar with this act. This passed President Trump's desk on March 18th, became law, and at this point now, over a week later, we are actually still waiting on the regulations from the Secretary of Labor to kind of guide us through this process and give us more clarity on a lot of the terms of what they're calling the FFCRA. So this is supposed to go into effect on April 1st and then be in effect through December 31st of 2020. And there are really two major parts to the Families First Act, which both expand the leave for employees, so both paid sick leave and paid family leave. So for employees that qualify, and we're going to kind of talk about in just a moment, what employees qualify and what employers are covered. But generally speaking, the paid leave entitlements for employees give employees up to 2 weeks or 80 hours of paid sick leave based on either what the higher of that employee's regular rate of pay is or the minimum federal wage that they're earning. This act actually does also apply to part-time employees as well. It's not just full-time employees. So for part-time employees, they are eligible for leave up to the number of hours that they would normally work during any 2-week pay period. Along with the sick leave portion of the Families First Act, there is also an expanded family leave, paid family leave portion, which will give employees up to 12 weeks of paid leave and expanded leave, which is paid at either 100%, depending on certain factors, which we'll go over in a moment, or 2/3 of their wages. So if you could go to the next slide, Bill, that would be great. So something I wanted to address, and we've gotten a lot of questions from our clients on really what is this act in comparison to what we are all familiar with as FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. And the difference, which is important here, is the expansion of the definitions of what is an eligible employee and what is a covered employer. So historically, under the FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, to be covered for any type of unpaid or paid medical leave, an employer had to employ at least 50 employees, and the employee had to have worked for that employer for consecutive 12 months for at least 1,250 hours before being eligible for this type of leave. The Families First Act has done away with all of those requirements and has expanded a covered employer to any employer that has fewer than 500 employees. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but they've also expanded the definition of what is an eligible employee. So you're no longer required to work for that employer for a full year or a certain number of hours. As long as you've been employed for 30 days, you would be eligible for this paid family leave. So the exceptions, which are important for all of you and for small businesses everywhere, is that this act excludes or may exclude employers with less than 50 employees if the employer can prove that it would jeopardize the viability of their business to have to comply with this act and provide any type of paid leave to their employees. This is where the caveat comes in that this act because we're still waiting on regulations and it has not actually gone into effect yet, it is difficult to say with certainty how an employer would prove that it jeopardizes the viability of their business to have to provide this leave. What the process is going to be for proving that is still undetermined at this point. The other important exemption from this coverage by the Families First Act is for healthcare providers and emergency responders. I know many of you have medical practices, and so the question has become, well, what is a healthcare provider? What is the definition? And we have to kind of dig back through the FMLA definition of healthcare provider to figure this out, because in the Families First Act, they don't actually define a healthcare provider. That may have been done intentionally because as we've seen, the government needs all of their healthcare providers and first responders to come to work and to do their job because there's already such a shortage. So I think they intentionally are leaving this definition out for now, but if you dig back through the FMLA, you'll find that right now, as it currently stands, a healthcare provider is going to be defined as physicians, chiropractors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and a few other types of healthcare providers. It's unclear whether nurses will qualify at this point under the current FMLA. They are not considered a healthcare provider, but this may be broadened when the regulations come into play and this actually goes into effect. So that is something to keep in mind, especially if you're a small business. Moving on to the next slide, this is an area that we are getting so many questions about is who qualifies for the leave. So let's say you are an employer that has 50 or more employees and you qualify and you want to know, well, which employees can actually take the leave. And there are 6 different categories of leave, and depending on what category the employee falls into depends on how much the employer would pay for them to actually take leave. One thing to keep in mind is that for the paid family leave, the first 10 days of that leave is actually unpaid. What an employee could potentially do is use the emergency sick leave portion, which is 10 days, to fill that gap. And so they would have 10 days of paid sick leave, and then they could still get on top of that the up to 12 weeks of, or 10 weeks of paid family leave. So one important thing to note is that if an employee qualifies and they're getting leave under any of these categories, the employer cannot force that employee to use accrued vacation or PTO or sick leave before using the paid family leave or the paid sick leave that's provided under this act. Depending on what category the employee falls into will determine how much they get in terms of monetary relief. So if the employee is taking leave for they're pursuant to a local quarantine or isolation order, or they've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, or they're actually experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, then they would get up to $511 daily for their leave, and that caps at, I think, $5,100. If the employee is caring for a child, or they're in self-quarantine, or they are caring for a child because the school is out or the daycare is out, then that employee would get up to 2/3 of their regular pay. And I believe that's capped at $200 per day and a $2,000 cap. So there are different caps for employees depending on what they're taking the leave for. So again, there are a lot of pieces of this act to digest, and there are still some unknowns until the regulations come out and this actually becomes effective, hopefully by April 1st. And moving on to the next bill, and maybe I actually will pause here if Sandy or Bill, if you wanted to add anything about Families First before I move on to the CARES Act.
No, I think there are some comments, but why don't we let you get through your main presentation, and then we'll go from there.
Great. So the new bill that actually has not yet passed, and what everyone is talking about, if you can go to the next slide, is the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, which we are calling the CARES Act for short. Oh, I'll just wait for it. There we go. So the CARES Act is the third emergency bill that Congress has prepared in response to the coronavirus pandemic, and it's likely to be signed into law as of tomorrow. I know we are still waiting to find out if that will happen. So this is all current as of today, but as we know, things can change by the hour. So this bill was intended to provide significant relief in the form of immediate cash flow for small businesses and healthcare providers. So they have given, and I think that 367 is actually changed to 349 billion for small businesses through SBA loan guarantees and subsidies, and then additional funding for SBA programs. So some of the highlights of the small business assistant part of this act include the Small Business Administration, the SBA, it has an existing program to give loans to businesses, and they're actually increasing the maximum loan amount for a small business to $10 million. And the allowable uses for that loan have also expanded in light of this coronavirus pandemic. And so now you can take out a loan up to 10 million, and you can use that not only for payroll support, which would include the paid sick and medical leave, but also for employee salaries and mortgage and rent payments, utility payments, insurance premiums, and any other debt obligations. So this small business act, or the small business portion of the act, is really just pushing money into small businesses and hoping to give them some relief during this time. They're also doing this in the form of loan forgiveness for small businesses. So certain borrowers are going to be eligible for loan forgiveness, which is equal to the amount that they spend during an 8-week period after the origination date of the loan. So if they spend that on payroll costs, any interest payment on a mortgage, rent on any lease, utilities, that's going to come back to them. And the amount that's actually forgiven is going to be reduced in proportion. This is where it gets a little bit confusing, but the amount that business takes out as a loan would be forgiven, and it's reduced in proportion to any reduction in the employees that are retained by that business compared to the prior year, and then to the reduction in pay of any employee beyond 25% of the prior year's compensation. So kind of, wrap your head around that. It gets confusing. But the important point for the small business portion of this act is that it's a way for small businesses to keep their employees on payroll and still get some form of relief. We're in this period of time right now where I have seen, I know personally, a lot of my clients trying to make the tough decision as to whether to furlough employees, whether they should just lay off, whether they close and reduce hours and salaries. And it is a very tough decision to make. And I think that the purpose of this bill is to allow businesses to keep going, pay their employees, keep them on payroll, and then take out the loans and have that money forgiven. So there is still a lot of questions regarding how this will play out, and where you'll go to. I think they're loosening a lot of the requirements that would typically be in place to get these loans and to have them forgiven. So the procedures have not been shared yet, but hopefully within the next day or two, we'll see some more processes in place for how this is actually going to work in practice. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So the other portion of the CARES Act that I know is definitely important for all of you is the support for the healthcare system. The real purpose of this is to put as much money into the healthcare system as we can right now. And I think that the primary goal here is to get more resources into the hands of healthcare providers, expand the access to care for patients during this time when we can't have in-office visits, and support our public health response in general. So they're removing a lot of the limitations on employers that would typically be in place because of the unique situation that we're in. So I will say the $100 billion, most of this money is going to hospitals and healthcare systems, and they're providing grants for research and protective equipment and testing supplies to really put as much into this healthcare system as we can right now. There's a breakdown of exactly where the money is going. And I think there is $16 billion going just to the strategic national stockpile so that they can procure more personal protective equipment, the PPE that everyone is on shortage for. And then there's $11 billion going to research, support research and development of vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics as well. So there are a lot of different resources being put into the system. And something else that is important for the healthcare side of this, which hasn't gotten as much attention, I don't think, but this bill contains a significant expansion of telehealth by allowing patients to see doctors with whom they don't actually already have an existing relationship, and they can connect through the telehealth system with physicians on a first-time basis. There are probably going to be some state stipulations and requirements, and there may be, I just actually had a question from a client yesterday wondering, since I'm in Illinois, whether Illinois has done away with the requirement for a face-to-face consultation in person. And it's still unclear whether the states are all going to comply with this federal provision or if they're still going to have certain requirements on the state level as well. Before I move on, I don't know if Sandy wanted to jump in here with some more specifics about the CARES Act.
Actually, Renee, let me just ask a couple of things. So obviously, this is none of this in the CARES Act is set in stone, but for most plastic surgeons, this is the thing that applies to them because most people don't have more than 50 employees. So I think people may get confused a little bit. So a loan that's forgiven is basically, I would call that a grant. So is that wrong?
No, that's not. It is going to be like a federal grant. So
okay.
It will be a loan that's forgiven. It will be equivalent to getting a grant.
And so can you just kind of restate what you said right now? And again, I want to clarify this for everybody. As Renee said, we don't really know what the final bill is going to say. So what we say today could change, but you
Sure.
said basically 8 weeks of expenses. And can you specifically, because I've heard different things like whether rent is in that or not and malpractice insurance, it's clearly your employees' salaries would be in there, but can you just go over what you believe is covered, at least right now from what we know?
Yeah, right now it would be, and this again is going to be, we don't know exactly who is eligible, right? So they're saying certain borrowers are going to be eligible for the loan forgiveness, and that forgiveness would be equal to the amount that they spend during that 8-week period after the origination date of the loan. So they take out the loan for the next 8 weeks, whatever they spend on payroll, mortgage interest, rent, leases, utilities, that is all going to be considered reimbursable under this loan.
Okay. And their banks would be providing them the money, or is this something they're being paid back?
The way we understand it is this is something that they would be paid back. So they're taking out the money and then in the form of a loan, and then they're being forgiven that money.
Okay. Let's just finish your last couple of slides, and then we'll get to Sandy.
So the other piece of this act is the expansion of the unemployment insurance benefit. So this is more of on the individual basis. It's an additional amount of money for a certain period of time, and it's extending unemployment benefits to both self-employed workers and independent contractors. So this is helping to support this gig economy that is become much more popular in the past few years. So it's not just payroll employees that are getting these unemployment benefits. They're also extending some of, typically there's a time period that you have to wait to get the benefits and for those benefits to go into place. So there's no longer going to be a waiting period. They're waiving that. And then they're extending the benefits for an additional period of time after state benefits might end. So really the goal here is to provide unemployment insurance benefits to a larger pool of people, a larger pool of employees. And then if you could go to the next slide. So there, as I said in the beginning, there are so many different parts of this CARES Act, and there is a lot to digest. And because it's not final yet, and we're still waiting for it to pass, things could change. But the other piece of this, which has gotten probably the most attention from a media perspective, are the stimulus checks. So this is going to be determined based on an individual's annual earnings. So the government is preparing to pay each individual a certain amount of money depending on what their income is. These funds obviously phase out the more money that you make. On a yearly basis, the less you're going to get from the government. So anyone who's making, I believe, $99,000 or over is getting nothing from the government. And then for each child that a family would have, they're receiving an additional stipend from the government for $500 per child. So the intention here is that low-income families are going to receive something. They say that that will be no less than $600. We'll see how that pans out as well. But that is the intent of the stimulus check portion of the CARES Act, is to give immediate cash flow to people who are in need and in crisis. And then the other portions of this act that are important to also mention are the testing and the treatment. If you've seen, on the news, we are really far behind in the testing compared to a lot of other countries, and there is a shortage of the testing, of the test kits. And so hopefully this will pump some money into the economy to offer additional testing and treatment right away when people need it. There are going to be paid family and sick leave rules, which kind of go hand in hand with the Families First Act. And then there is certain bailout amounts and assistance for industries as well. All in all, I think there's a lot to digest from this act, and it, as we see things shake out, we will have more as well. Oh, yes, and as my final slide. So I found a good graph, which I thought was helpful it's from the CARES Act, and it just shows as we were talking about, these stimulus checks are going to phase out. So this graph
Looks like we lost her. Let me just try to mute and unmute her. Bill?
Okay. So when Renee comes back, I actually have a couple follow-ups for her, but Sandy, are you, let's go back to Sandy. Are you here, Sandy?
I am. Can you hear me?
So I think a lot of people know Sandy Roos, but she's been doing this for 30 years. I know Sandy very well. She's excellent at what she does and really relates well to surgeons. Sandy's going to share some perspective on this. Again, we don't know what's in all these relief bills, but one thing that we've heard from surgeons is they're just like letting their employees go and they're closing their doors. And I think, my advice is that everybody needs to take a deep breath here. There's a lot of things moving around, and so until we know exactly what these packages are, that may not be the best idea, for you or your practice. So Sandy, kind of give people your perspective on this, and then we'll kind of move from there. But thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. So I also just want to, Blaine, we were laughing. I've been doing plastic surgery business consulting for like 18 years. But I've been working in the medical field for 30. I just don't want anybody to think that I've been consulting with plastic surgeons for 30 years. But I thank you, Dr. Adams, Bill, for inviting me to be on this webinar. And it is something that I'm hearing. I'm hearing a lot of things from practices, and I was kind of taken aback when I was hearing they were putting, furloughing, and they were laying off, and without really knowing fully what was going to be happening. And I do feel in some instances, there are some roles in the practice that, it probably would be an okay time to make that decision a little bit earlier on than the others. But what I'm seeing in the practices is that, leads are still coming in. Some practices are reporting that they're getting more leads now. And so I really think it's beneficial to not, just only have your lead staff or your front office staff maybe only working 20 hours or 30 hours as we're trying to decide which, is it the CARES Act or is it the other bill that would be more applicable to us? We really want to make sure that you're taking advantage of this time and answering the leads, educating your staff. I've been doing this for so many years, and practices are always wanting to implement new processes to create, a more educated patient, to increase their conversion rate, but they always claim they don't have time to really get those processes in place. And so this is the time to be doing that, to have, weekly, biweekly, or, twice weekly calls, or through Zoom or through other platforms, excuse me, and educating your staff on all the things that you've been saying for so long that you don't have time to do. Pay your employees through this time, use whatever, plan works best for you, but don't just lay off. And even one practice said, well, we're only seeing follow-ups 2 days a week in the practice because they can still go in because they're, a medical practice. Don't just lay off that employee, utilize them in other ways, work on your website, pick your before and after photos. There's so many different things you need to be doing right now so that when we do go back, because you're going to be super busy, you're not going to have time to go back and try to figure out what you should be doing or what you should have been doing at this time. And so I like that Bill said that, take a deep breath, take a step back, and, let's look at the bigger picture. I'm seeing that there's not as much doom and gloom in a lot of areas of the country than there are in other areas. And I think that's what's also causing a lot of the issues is that, in California, Northern California, Washington State, New York, and parts of Louisiana, they're in a lot bigger, better, different crisis than those of us that are kind of in the middle of the United States. So that is just something I think we just need to do is really, like I said, take a step back and let's be smart about this and not just make decisions based off of fear.
If I could add, I think one of the most confusing things for everyone is that there's no time point to the end of citywide lockdown and stuff. So when we're reacting to it immediately now, there's reassessment happening constantly. So statements right now pertain to now, but obviously a 2 to 3 week lockdown and social distancing finally as required, not outside of medicine, just in general in society is happening as we go everywhere. So let's plan for reassessing in 2 to 3 weeks before you let all your employees go and other businesses let their employees go. And all of a sudden we have a manufacturing backlog and, your business processes backlog once we're back up. I mean, if we can get through this as a society in a month, you don't want to be out your entire staff and have to hire out of a new pool of American workers and retrain. So As much as you can keep people now and keep them training, and then in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if you can afford to keep them, then we can assess how long is this really going to go as the numbers change.
Correct. And I think Bill and I, we did a series through the plastic surgery channel this week. And one of the things, and Bill, I can't remember the name we gave it, was like the reentry plan. And I know there's going to be some practices that are, as soon as they're told they're going to be able to go back and practice, that then they're going to come up with their plan, like communicating to the to the patients and who's going to be doing what. And so again, this is the time to be, I'm calling it the reentry. Make a plan. I mean, I'm working with practices right now. Like, what are we going to be doing when we're told that starting Monday, we could start seeing patients, And so I think now, again, let's plan for if it's 3 weeks or 4 weeks, depending where you are. Because to Blaine's point, there are some states that, they have an end date. Here in Texas, I think it's the 21st. I might be wrong on that, incorrect. But some states have actually given a date. And so, other states haven't, and that might be extended at some point. I don't think anybody knows. But again, be smart now and get these things done.
Yeah, I think Dr. Pittman just made a good point, and that is kind of the point of furlough versus laying people off fully. That furlough is going to allow you some flexibility in cash load in this immediate term when we're assessing how long is this going, so you don't just wipe across your slate.
Yeah, but I think, Blaine, and Sandy, and then I actually have some follow-up for Renee too now that she's back. But Sandy, can you comment specifically on your thoughts on, if somebody did, let's say, let their employees go, and now their employees are getting unemployment, now with this information from the CARES Act, you actually, it sounds like you can keep your employees, at least from what we know right now, for 8 weeks. You're going to get those expenses forgiven. So do you have any recommendations? Should they just hire their employees back, or can they rescind the unemployment? Can you make comments about that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. And that's what I've seen a lot of the questions that they've been asking. Is that something, if I've already done that, what is that going to be? And I don't think anybody knows at this time. But what I do.
Renee, can you make a comment on that?
Yeah, so if they bring the employees back, if they were laid off as of March 1st and they bring them back, then they could qualify for the CARES Act if they employ them through June 30th. So you do have a window of time for those employees that were laid off to actually come back to work and put them back on the payroll. And that way you would be eligible for relief under the CARES Act.
And then this is for either of you, but in terms of, the SBA loans, those have been around for a while. So if somebody, let's say last week, went and applied for that loan, can they still take advantage of the CARES Act? Or are they now down a different funnel, or what's
that's a great question. I should have addressed that. So they would not actually be eligible. So if you have already received, because previously there was state relief and state disaster relief loans, and there was as part of that first emergency bill, Congress made an expansion to the SBA loans for the 7A loans. So if you have already applied for one of those 7A loans, you can't double dip and now get additional relief under the CARES Act loan. So it's one or the other.
Okay. And Renee, these are a couple of things that I had for you when I think Blaine took one of the hamsters off your internet wheel. So, I don't know what happened, but when you dropped out.
I think I will apologize. It's probably my spotty internet here. So.
Yeah, well, thank AT&T for that, right?
Okay,
so let me ask you about this. So in terms of that, you kind of detailed that basically the expenses over an 8-week period are going to be forgiven, but what about the doctor's salary? Is that because most people employ themselves just like they employ their employees? Is the doctor considered an employee in that formula?
I would think so. If they're on the payroll and they're a cost of the business on the payroll, then I would think yes. I haven't seen anything to say otherwise yet, but it generally covers payroll salaries of employees. So if they are paying themselves as a salaried individual, then I would think they would be able to get the relief for their own salary as well.
And I think one of the things that I saw, one of the questions, and I'm going to read it here. It's for the loans. It says that it's up to 100,000. So like if you make over 100,000 annually, that it's like stopped at that point. And so,
right, that's a good point to mention that this is for employees that make 100,000 or less.
Well, and if they make over 100, they're going to consider them at 100,000 is what it read here. I don't know again if that's accurate or not, because it says we treat them as if they were 100,000 total.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. So in other words, if they make 150,000, it's regardless, they're only going to be treated at 100. And then one of the questions that I've asked and I haven't received the answer is, you might have somebody that it's based off of their salary, not their total compensation. So if you have a patient care coordinator that you might be paying 85,000 salary, but their total comp's at 120 with bonus, what we've been told, it's at the 85,000 salary. Again, everything's not clear yet, but that is how it's been interpreted so far.
And Renee, just to follow up on that, is there, in this formula, is there a cap on somebody's expenses?
Well, I mean, the loan is up to $1 million, or I'm sorry, $10 million. The cap on the expenses, from my understanding, is I don't think there is I'm not actually familiar with a cap on it, because it's up to $10 million for the loan. It's up to 10 years. So it would begin going backwards actually from February 15th to December 31st. And then
it does say 2.5 times our 12 months payroll up to February 15, 2020. So I don't know where, it's talking about the max loan is the lesser of 10 million and 2.5 times our 12 months payroll up to February 15th. So in other words, I think they take payroll as of February 15th, 2020 for the 12 months prior.
Yes, you are correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so in terms of, if this is for either of you, does anybody know how somebody is going to apply for, how in the CARES Act, how does somebody apply for that relief?
That is something I still don't have an answer for. I mean, it should be done through the SBA, but I think the SBA is going to be working in connection with the various banks. So I don't know what the application process is going to look like from a practical standpoint.
Well, I think one of the things it says is that it's a loan backed by the SBA, but you have to go through the banks. Now, It was interesting last night, the Secretary of the Treasurer, he made a statement that it was going to be that you can go in by the end of next week to your local bank and fill it out and be funded that day. I have not seen anything that has shown that was a truthful statement, but he said it on the air in a live press conference. And so originally they said you were going to have to go through the SBA, but now they're telling us we have to go through our banks. But then they're also saying on the one it says the banks must approve the paperwork within 60 days. And so I'm waiting to get some clarification based off of what they're telling everybody at the press conference versus what the rules look like. But it sounds to me like that they're trying to make it more simple so that it can be a quicker process. And that's why I think we're probably going to get more once it's approved. I know somebody went up to their local bank, a Bank of America today, to ask some questions. And they said at their level, they haven't been told anything yet. I'm sure it's at the corporate level they have, but at the local level that they still haven't received any information or guidelines. So.
And I just want to, I've been looking at a couple of the comments that have come across, a couple of which are getting my blood pressure up, but I'm okay. So, all right, I just want to clarify a couple of things just to make it very simple. So when we're talking about a forgiven loan, that is a grant. Okay, that's something, so you're going to be able to, it looks like about 2.5 times your expenses over, that's going to be looked at the previous year, and you're going to be able to get those over your 8-month expenses, and that's a grant that you don't have to pay back. But my follow-up question for you all is, if somebody needs more cash to operate their business, then they could apply for additional funds that they would have to pay back. Is that accurate?
That is what I understood. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's just two separate things. I think people are getting confused about loans and forgiveness, and so there is a portion of it that you don't have to pay back. That's relief.
This is all through the SBA. So if they took out a separate loan that they're going to pay back that's not backed by the SBA, through their bank, I don't see any reason they wouldn't be able to do that. But the caveat here is that if they have already applied for an SBA loan, they then cannot get this additional SBA loan. So that's where the cutoff is going to be. Now, if it's some other loan that they've already applied for that's not through the SBA and is through their bank, then yes, potentially there shouldn't be an issue with them applying for this one. But that might be, again, could be based on the state they're in. So I would definitely check with their particular bank and their particular lender to find out what the stipulations are, if any.
Okay, thank you. And I saw a couple of comments saying, well, we didn't, like, there's nothing set in stone and we shouldn't be talking about this. I think that's completely wrong. We actually need to be talking about this now, because just like Sandy was talking about, people are letting their employees go where it looks like the main deal of the CARES Act is to try to allow people to keep their employees.
Right.
And so I think that it's important that people get this information, and that's why we're talking about it. And we're trying to give everybody the best up-to-date information. Obviously, next week we will update people on anything that we, things hopefully will be passed by then. It's taken a long time to have it passed, but we'll update people on that. Blaine, I'm looking through the questions. Do you have some that you've pulled that you think would be good? Yeah, go ahead and let's
just run through some of these. So thank you guys for the streaming questions. I wish I could copy them from my computer, but only can write them. So first off, I think we've talked about some of this, but how does a loan work? Do you need to have a certain percent of your employees still on payroll to qualify?
Yeah, I don't know what that percentage is offhand. We'll get that
for our update on Monday then. So just realize that these are now going to go every Monday and Thursday. So already planned for Monday here. Let me just show you guys. Is this? So we'll definitely have the update. So we have these experts talking here with as much research they could do with the bill passing just over the wee hours last night. So this is just to get ahead of it. Make sure you can keep as many employees as you can financially cover for the next foreseeable future. Understanding a lot of people have been doing this for 2 weeks. So I've been locked down since 13th, and now Denver is on citywide lockdown through the 11th. So that's a month of all of us hanging out just on virtual chat. But we'll cover that and an update on Monday.
And what I'll add to that is,
go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I don't know what the exact percentage is, but the loan amount is going to be reduced by any meaningful reductions that you make in employee wages between or layoffs of employees. So during that covered period, the more employees you lay off, the less money you're going to get, right? That loan reduces by the number of employees that are laid off.
I just got it from one of my sources who's dealing with the same thing with a slightly larger corporation, and they are talking in the background about this being about 90%. So laying off even 10% of your force, and who knows how that's going to be measured? Is it by total payroll or is it by actual heads? We don't know. So the best thing to do is hold as much as you can now till we can get updates rather than just reacting. And but everyone's in a different financial situation. So.
Let me pose a question to Sandy, because I think this has come up a couple of times, looks like in the chat. But so people are saying, so based on the CARES Act, they, instead of furloughing their employees, is your recommendation that they keep their employees at home working because they're going to get basically relief to do that? And I would interpret that from what you said, that they should basically work on trying to do things that they've not been able to do in their practices if they're able to keep the employees working at home, because people are not really able to go in the office right now with this shelter-in-place order.
Correct. And so I think what's important to even what Renee had said is that if you've had them furloughed, which she believes are laid off, that you can bring them back now, but it's just for 60 days from when, if I'm not mistaken, from the time like the loan has been, that you've applied for the loan. It can go retroactive. It's very weird the way everything's worded in here. But I mean, for me, I would bring back my employees because I want them to get things done. I just feel there's more that we need to do, and you're going to get paid for them, because I think what Renee said is we don't know that if you've laid off if you have, 10 employees and you have 6 come back full time and those other 4 you kept laid off, is that going to count because they know you've had 10 employees for the last year, but you've only rehired or kept 6?
So let me follow as both of you on this. So if you've had employees that you've laid off, but you want to bring them back because of this information, so can you guys walk us through the process to do that? Is there anything people need to know about or do you just say, hey, you're rehired back?
Well, I think that will depend on whether you actually laid them off or furloughed them.
Go through both scenarios for us, Renee.
Yeah, I mean, if you've laid them off, there is a fire and rehire process, right? If someone's been laid off, there is a benefit termination date. Whether or not that's already occurred, that would be one consideration. Have their benefits terminated? Are they now applying for COBRA? Or are they do they still have their benefits available to them? So that's one consideration. It would be a process to tell the employees, okay, we had to lay you off due to financial reasons, and now we are able to bring you back. And going through that you really are going through a rehire process. If it's a furlough, those employees have not technically been laid off. They have just been temporarily put on hold is really what it is. Typically, the benefits are going to continue through a furlough, and they also are still eligible for unemployment insurance. Some states also allow partial unemployment insurance. So even if you had a reduction in hours, you may still be able to get unemployment. So once you bring those employees back, you want to look at those different considerations, what this means for their pay and their hours and their insurance benefits, as well as whether or not they've already applied for unemployment insurance benefits.
Okay, so let me say if you let the employees go, then they need to go back through the fire rehire process. Is that
exactly?
And if they furloughed, you can probably just bring them back as non-furloughed. But furlough is basically a leave of absence, so they can cut their leave of absence short and basically come back, right?
Yeah, there's not that same process that you're going to have to go through with a laid off employee. Exactly.
And then what about employees that people have that are working from home, but the doc has reduced their hours? So Renee, what is your recommendation? Should people now make those people full-time hours based on this, or what's
that's kind of dependent upon what their status is. I would say, I mean, you have to look at whether they're a salaried exempt employee versus a non-exempt employee that's typically going to be hourly. Was that reduction in hours something that was, done across the board? Was it done in a way that was tied to a reduction in pay and wages? So there's a lot of individual considerations to look at. You don't want to willy-nilly change someone's status. So for instance, if you have an exempt salaried employee, if you reduce their wages or their hours to a certain point, their status could potentially change from exempt to non-exempt. And now they are a non-exempt employee, which is a completely different classification under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So you want to look at it on an individual basis to determine what is best for that employee. And if you did an across-the-board reduction in wages or an across-the-board reduction in hours, it may be easier to, bring them back if they're all hourly non-exempt employees and you just cut all of their hours by half. You could probably much more easily just bring them back and up their hours. But I would say another thing to consider during this time is, a lot of employers may be saying, well, I still don't feel like I can afford to bring back my whole staff, or I feel like I can't afford to have my whole staff. So really looking at who are your key employees, your essential staff to keep on during this time, and potentially just bringing them back. They may not be working in the office. They are working from home and doing tasks that they can do from home. But if you can't bring back the whole staff, looking at who are those key people.
And I think one of the things that I read, and it might answer some of the questions that people are typing, is that they're going to be taking this as of February 15th, 2020. And so I think they've done that. So if somebody's like, oh, I'm going to raise somebody's salary now so they can get paid more, it's as of February 15th is the numbers from your payroll, because you're going to have to bring your payroll report is one of the things that they're requiring. It's going to be as of February 15th, 2020.
And I'll just add that I believe there's also a minimum wage requirement so that you can't drop their wages and their hours such that they're not even making minimum wage at that point. They're not counting towards you to qualify.
And in terms of that payroll, again, Renee or Sandy, so it's as of February 15th, and they're going to look back a year.
Yes.
That's
okay.
Right.
And then they're giving you 8 months or 2 months of the payroll over, the average payroll over a year, and you're getting 2 months of it, or is it 2.5 times?
Well,
going back to that maximum that we were talking about, and maybe just to put it in more context, because I think Sandy did a great job. So it's that maximum loan amount is either it's going to be the lesser of 10 million, or the product that you would get, the number you would get by multiplying the average total monthly payments for a payroll cost during that 1 year period before the loan is obtained by 2.5 times that payroll cost. So for an example, let's say
you have for that.
I hope so, because math is not my strong suit. So, but the example that I was given would be if the loan was made on April 1, 2020, and the average monthly payroll cost for that period between April 1 of 2019 and April 1 to 2020, so that prior year, let's say those average payroll costs were 1.5 million, then that maximum loan amount, if you took the 2.5 times, that would be 3.75 million. So that's how they're calculating this.
And I also, please, Renee, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we can get a loan up to what you had just said, but what's forgiven is the 60 days and for the rent and for mortgage interest and that, and then the rest and then is just a loan, correct?
Right.
And it's also worth noting, again, reminder for this, all the information we're talking about today is really two different things. So there's the SBA loan that has a maximum of $2 million. And then what Renee just went through just now is talking about the actual CARE Act, should it all come out and be properly dispersed.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of that stuff has been fairly consistent. So the changes have not, been, some of that hasn't pertained to that. So it's probably going to be pretty similar to that. But one thing that we will put out is, like a fact sheet. Once it's passed and we know exactly what's in it, we'll take a lot of these points, which have been excellent, and make sure that the final act and law that's been passed, and put those in a bullet like a summary. So we have about 4 minutes before we get to the hour. So Renee or Sandy, is there anything else that you would like to clarify, or things that you've seen? Renee, why don't you start?
Gosh, there's so much, Bill. Nothing I can think of to clarify at this point. I would say, just keeping in mind, and this is something I've been advising my clients, is that communication is going to be key from employers to their employees during this period. So the more you can communicate and just update your employees with whatever decisions you're making will really go a long way. I had a client I spoke with earlier today who was trying to decide whether or not to tell employees when they'd be paid. And I said, definitely tell them. The employees are looking to their employers for guidance during this period. And I realize it's a huge burden for employers to bear during this time, but you will have a much smoother sailing going forward if you just let the employees know what your plan is.
And we'll help provide details and updates here. I mean, a lot of the questions we're getting here in the chat are very specific to certain employees being hired on certain dates and furloughed and stuff. So, that's going to be very nitty-gritty specifics. You'll have to talk with your CPA or whoever is reading this when this is all done.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I did see a few times is and Renee presented it, and this will all be available online within 24 hours, but somebody has to work for you for at least 30 days to be eligible. So if you just hired them a couple weeks ago, they're not going to be eligible, at least for the CARES. And I think Family First as well. Sandy, any concluding remarks?
I don't. I am going to, what Renee just said, I think this is the time to really have a plan for your employees, have a plan like what you're going to be doing. And it is an unsure time, but I've learned a lot through this. I really don't have anything else to add because I think everybody's, answered the questions as best we could.
Okay. And I just would, I just saw another thing in the chat. Somebody said, should I apply for an SBA loan or wait for the CARES Act? And I think what you're, basically Renee and Sandy both commented on this. So if you've already applied for an SBA loan, then you're not going to be eligible for the CARES Act. If you're trying to decide, we don't know 100% what's in the CARES Act. So just take a deep breath, give it a few days. It's not going to change anything, and see, decide what's better for you. I would think that probably the CARES route for most plastic surgery practices is going to be better, but that remains to be seen until it's passed. With that, I'm gonna conclude the webinar. What I'd like to kind of leave everybody with is that this is an ongoing situation. We have set up regular webinars on Monday and Thursdays, at least for the next 2 weeks, to address many of these topics. So Monday, we will be talking about virtual consults, HIPAA, a lot of interrelated things. Sandy, again, will join us for that. We're also going to have a couple plastic surgeons to give their perspective on virtual consultation. That will be moderated by Dr. Jamil Ahmad. We'll send more information on that. And on Thursday, Robert Singer will be moderating a webinar. It's going to be more on some business management type, cash flow type topics, and we'll get more details to you on that. I will also tell you that the society recognizes this is a very stressful time for all of you. We are trying our best to provide you with as much information as we can. I also want to put a kudos out to Sue Dykma, our executive director, and her staff, who are working tirelessly right now trying to put all these things together for you. Charlie Thorne, our president, as well. So the society, the Aesthetic Society, is there for you. We're going to continue giving you as much information as we can. In the future, and a little beyond these emergency webinars, we also are looking at ways for people to get CME, because I know with the meeting not occurring at the end of April, a lot of people have that on their mind. So we're going full throttle for you. Remember, a couple things. One of my friends says, keep a cool mind, a warm heart, and clean hands. So remember that, and keep telling your patients and your friends it's about of the people, for the people, and by the people. And with that, we'll conclude. Good night, and God bless.